I could hear their boots on the stone floor. Slow, deliberate, moving from room to room, only a few feet from where I was pressed against the cold wall, barely breathing. I had been inside that palace for 6 hours by then, and the only thing standing between an entire kingdom and the collapse of everything just was one small folded document hidden inside my robe. Every time those footsteps paused, my heart stopped with them. Because I knew if they found me, the document would disappear, the truth would be buried, and thousands of innocent people would never know what had been done to them. But here is what I need you to understand before I tell you how I got there. By the end of this story, you are going to realize that the greatest danger inside that palace was never the men with weapons moving through the halls. The greatest danger was the truth itself, and what certain powerful people were willing to do to make sure it never saw the light of day. To understand why I willingly walked into the most dangerous building in the kingdom, I have to take you back to who I was before any of this happened. My name is Sister Margot. I was a nun. I had lived inside the convent of Saint Alara for nearly 20 years, and I believed with everything I had that my purpose was simple: feed the hungry, comfort the suffering, keep honest records of the people we served. That was my life. Small, quiet, completely ordinary. The only thing that ever set me apart from the other sisters was my work in the convent archives. I had spent years organizing welfare records, documenting families we helped, and maintaining correspondence with the palace administrative office on behalf of the poor who depended on us. I was trusted because I was careful, and I was careful because I understood that words written on paper outlast almost everything else. The kingdom I lived in was called Velenthor, a fictional name, but a real enough kind of place. A medieval kingdom built around a magnificent royal palace called the Ardenmoor, with grand reception halls and forgotten servant corridors and underground archive chambers that nobody had opened in decades. The palace had been the center of power for generations. But when King Aldrich fell gravely ill in the autumn of that year, everything beneath the surface began to shift. Noble families who had smiled at each other for years started whispering in corners. Advisors who had served loyally suddenly became difficult to find, and documents that should have been easy to locate began disappearing from official records. I did not know any of that when a young royal attendant arrived at our convent gate one evening, shaking so badly she could hardly speak. Her name was Celia. She was maybe 19 years old, and she had served in the palace records chamber for 2 years. She told me she had found something hidden inside a sealed archive room that almost no one knew still existed. She said it was a royal decree, signed by the king's own hand years before his illness, a legal succession document naming his younger daughter, Princess Vielle, as the rightful heir in the event that his elder son, Lord Cavan, was found to have engaged in corruption. And Celia said she had already found the evidence of that corruption: financial records, forged land grants, payments routed through false accounts, all of it buried inside that same forgotten room. She said she was terrified to go back alone. She said the head administrator, a man named Severin, had been watching her since she started asking questions. She begged me to come with her, not to fight anyone, not to steal anything, just to be a witness, to help her retrieve the decree and deliver it to the kingdom's independent judicial council before anyone could stop it from reaching them. I told her I needed to think. She told me she did not have time to let me think. We entered the palace through the charity service entrance. I had used it dozens of times over the years to deliver aid records to the administrative office. No one questioned a nun walking through the back gate. That was my one advantage. I was completely invisible to people who believed that power only lived in expensive clothing and loud voices. Celia guided me through a servant corridor I had never seen before, down a narrow stairwell that smelled of old stone and damp wood, and into a part of the palace that felt like it belonged to another century entirely. The archive room was real. Everything she had described was real, and when I held that succession decree in my hands, I understood immediately why someone would want it destroyed. We had maybe started organizing the documents when we heard the first sound: footsteps, not the relaxed shuffle of a palace servant. These were the measured, controlled footsteps of someone who was searching. Celia grabbed my arm without a word. We pressed ourselves into the far corner behind a row of shelving, and I pulled the decree inside my robe and folded it as small as it would go. 3 men entered the archive room. They did not carry torches openly. They carried small covered lanterns, which told me they did not want to be seen. They moved through the room systematically, pulling open drawers, overturning boxes, barely speaking to each other except in low murmurs I could not fully hear. One of them said a name I recognized: Severin. He had sent them. Celia and I did not move for what felt like an hour. When they left, I turned to her and said we had to split up. She knew more hidden corridors than I did, and she was more likely to make it to the Judicial Council quickly. She agreed. She took a duplicate list of the financial records she had already memorized and slipped into the corridor. I went the opposite direction, carrying the original decree. What I did not expect was to become completely turned around inside a part of the palace I had never entered before. I found myself in a sealed library above the East Wing, surrounded by journals and correspondence going back decades. I barricaded myself inside and waited, thinking I could wait until morning when the palace would fill with enough people that I could walk out without being noticed. But the men kept searching. They were not going to stop. So I read, because that was what I knew how to do. I pulled journals from the shelves and I read by the narrow light coming through a high window. And that is when I found it, a handwritten private journal belonging to Aldrich himself, not the official records, his personal reflections. And inside that journal, I found entries describing conversations with Severin years before his illness. Severin had proposed the corruption scheme himself. He had coached Lord Cavan. He had drawn up the forged land grants personally. And Aldrich had not exposed him because he was afraid that doing so publicly would destabilize the kingdom. Instead, he had quietly signed the decree in secret, hidden it inside the archive room, and told only one other person where it was: a servant woman named Dora, who had died 2 winters ago, and who I suddenly realized was Celia's grandmother. That stopped me completely. Everything I had believed about this night rearranged itself in one breath. Celia had not come to me randomly. She had grown up knowing this secret. She had spent 2 years working in that palace specifically to find what her grandmother had protected. She had come to me not just because I was trustworthy, but because my access to the charity entrance was the one route she could not take alone without drawing suspicion. I was not just a witness. I had been carefully chosen, and I found I was not even angry about it. I understood it. Sometimes protecting justice means using every honest tool available. I heard footsteps again, closer now. I pushed the journal back onto the shelf. Then I stopped and pulled it back out, because without it, the decree alone could be challenged. A document without corroborating evidence is just paper. A document supported by the king's own private testimony was something entirely different. I tucked the journal beside the decree inside my robe. There was a small exterior door at the back of the library that led to a narrow upper courtyard. I had noticed it when I first entered. I had spent the last several hours telling myself it was too exposed to use. But I was out of options and out of darkness to hide in. So I went through it. I walked across that courtyard in plain sight, moving as calmly as I had walked across 1,000 other courtyards in my life. Slowly, deliberately, carrying nothing visibly. Just a nun, crossing a courtyard, as if she had every reason in the world to be there. No one stopped me. I reached the charity gate. I walked through it, and I kept walking until the palace walls were behind me. By sunrise, I was sitting before the full independent Judicial Council of Velenthor with the decree and the journal laid open on the table in front of me. Celia arrived less than an hour after me, exhausted and pale but safe, with her memorized list written out in full. The council moved with a speed I had never seen from any official body before. Severin was placed under lawful detainment before midday. Lord Cavan's forged records were formally examined within 48 hours. Princess Vielle was formally recognized as the rightful heir within the week, with the full legal succession document presented publicly before the kingdom's appointed council. The men who had searched that palace were identified through testimony from 2 frightened royal attendants who had witnessed them entering and finally felt safe enough to speak. They faced the full process of the kingdom's established judicial authority. No violence, no confrontation, just the slow, steady, unstoppable weight of documented truth. Severin, when he finally sat before the council, reportedly asked how the document had survived. No one told him a nun had been sitting 12 feet away while his men searched every drawer in that archive room. History remembers thrones. History remembers the people who sat in them. It does not often remember the ones who stayed up all night in a cold library protecting the truth from people who had weapons and power and every reasonable advantage. I came home to the convent 2 days later. I sat in the chapel for a long time without saying anything, and then I got back to work, because that was what I knew how to do. I think about Celia sometimes. I think about Dora, the servant woman who spent years quietly carrying a secret that was never hers to benefit from. I think about how often the people who actually hold history together are the ones no record ever names. And I think about that moment in the courtyard when I chose to walk forward instead of staying hidden. Not because I was brave, because staying hidden had finally stopped being enough. Courage is not always standing in the open with a sword. Sometimes it is quietly protecting the truth while the entire world is searching for the wrong person. So let me ask you this. If you had been in that palace, holding that document, with those footsteps getting closer and closer, would you have stayed hidden? Or would you have risked everything to make sure the truth survived? Leave your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this story reminded you that real bravery often happens where no one is watching, please share it with someone who needs to hear that today, because some stories deserve to be remembered even when history forgot to write them down.